Today, I review, I discuss, and I share with you the Diary of Anne Frank, the graphic adaptation. That's right, this is a comic book illustrated version of this book. Now, if you guys haven't heard of this book, it's very, very popular. A lot of people read it. It's a kind of historical uh, diary. It was literally a diary of a young girl who went through World War II as a Jew. And, I'd heard a lot about it. And it wasn't until now that I found a medium that um, was enjoyable enough for me to go through the story. I preferred this to reading a text version. So I want to go through and give you my thoughts on the book and what you can learn from it. I think it's very it brings up so many emotions because I mean this girl was smart, capable, and she had all this going for her. And of course, as expected, she had a really, really tough time being persecuted by the Germans and hid out in the attic. And so I want to give you my thoughts and first impressions because I really didn't know much at all about the book until I read this thing. And all I knew before were basic minimal stuff. Like, it's a sad story. A lot of people bought the book. I think millions of copies were sold afterwards. It was literally a diary that she wrote just for herself, and it chronicled her whole journey until her death. I didn't even know if she died or not. I just knew like there was some bits of starvation involved, and they hid out in an attic, and she may or may not have died, and I think it was a sad ending. I didn't really know much, so I kind of want to come to you with that kind of initial impressions view, because that's where I'm at. Now, I spent a good 2 hours going through this book. I will say I haven't read every page yet because it takes some time to get through. I think I read the first quarter of the book, and then for the next hour or so, I started to do some skimming because I wanted to see like this will take you like a really long time to finish. So I started to move through it quickly and read like portions of it because I just wanted to see like how did it end? Like what ended up happening? And yes, spoiler alert, it did not end well. I really feel bad for her and her family because she got so far and she almost made it, and it really just sucks. Let me tell you a few things that I learned from the book and why I think this is well worth the read. I actually think that if you have a good library, it may be available because this is a very popular series. You might be able to find the illustrated version for free at your library, or go to Barnes and Nobles or some bookstore and just read it there. But one of the first big things that I noticed immediately was she had a life not that different from ours. If the drawings are accurate and the diary and everything is accurate, she had a pretty normal life in a way before all the crap happened with the Germans, labeling the Jews as like the cause of all this and trying to like exterminate them all. And what I mean by that is if you look at the pictures here, the places she lived, the things she owned. I mean, look how beautiful this bridge is. Look how beautiful the scenery is in the pages where she's just like walking around. Like there's all sorts of, there's a pool, there's trees, there's a bus. They have good clothes on. They talk a lot about all the stuff that they have. And I got the sense, wow, they had a good life before this. And I mean that in the most positive of ways. As in, this wasn't some distant time with different people in a different land. And sure, it is in certain ways, but it wasn't that long ago. This was like 1945, which is like, as of this recording, about 70 years, which really isn't that long. That's like one lifetime, one person's lifetime, one generation, and this happened, and it just really sucks. Because this, she had a good thing going. This was the attic that she. Well, this must be like a visual depiction or best recreation, but it was a decent house, definitely very cramped still, because like I think three of them had to share this tiny room here, and then like basically they had this whole secret hidden path of the house that they hid in. They actually had a secret hidden bookcase entrance, which was pretty insane. But it really makes you think. It really makes you think, man. It makes me feel grateful, and it makes me feel upset because, like, just based off the luck of the draw, you could have been born in the wrong place and time, the wrong ethnicity, and you were screwed. And that really just sucks. It really does. And it also takes me back to when I visited the Holocaust Museum. And that was also very, very sombering. But, when you look at this, that's the first thing. Like, man, they had a pretty decent life before this. They had possessions. And if you go even further, they had all sorts of different things. This is when they started hiding out. But even then, they had scarves. They had valuables, clothing, bicycles. So this is one of the people that hid out with them. She bought like expensive pots and all this stuff. So that was the first thing, and I was like, okay, interesting. Wow, they kind of lived in that place. And I think the second thing was, she was smart and cultured, and she had a lot going for her. At the time, they were persecuted. The Jewish people were persecuted, and many thought them to be lesser people, less smart, less capable, toxic. But look at all the stuff they had, or they could have. This says, imagine that I'd gone to Switzerland. Daddy and I slept in one room in my father's family's huge mansion in the Alps. She was actually pretty cultured with the rest of her family. And what I mean by that is she did a lot of studying and reading. You could tell she was smart. They basically had to keep silent all day so that they wouldn't get caught, because they were basically hiding in a house that operated as a business with a entire secret half of the house on the other side, which was hidden by a trick bookcase doorway, which sounds cool, but it was a very cramped house. And one of the pages that really stood out, that kind of showed that she was pretty cultured, was all the stuff that she was reading and studying back when this happened. And that included Greek mythology, learning different languages, different history, different wars, the 7-Year War, all this stuff. She was able to read and learn. And that's what her and the rest of the kids that hung out there basically did. They just studied as much as they could, memorized things. And so, she even finished, or she was going through Galileo's biography. Here's the page I was looking for. All the stuff that she was reading and learning. She finished 250 pages of Galileo Galilei. Then next week was the second part, 240 pages. She finished the first volume of the biography of Charles V. Next week, she had to work out the genealogical charts. She finished studying the 7 Years' War. Then next week was the 9 Years' War. She learned 50 Greek words by heart, 50 French words, and then she started studying Greek mythology. And then next week, her beloved movie stars, who won which awards and when. And so as you can see, she had all this life in her, all this intelligence, and she just saw herself as a normal girl, and maybe she was, but still, there's a lot of value and amazingness in that. She even had, was creating short stories, and she was, practicing her short story writing during that time. And this page kind of goes into detail about some of that short story writing she was doing. So incredible life she lived. She was very smart, but very tragic as well. So basically, what they did was she and a bunch of her family and family friends stayed in this attic for a very long time, and they went through all sorts of issues. Everything had to start to get rationed, and there's all sorts of issues. Invasions were happening, as you can see here, and bombings were happening. Things were starting to just be a mess. Here's basically what seems to be sirens going off all day and all night. And when you go through this book, you're like, man, she's going to make it through. She's made it through so much. They've been hiding out in here for the longest time ever, over a year. And they run into all sorts of issues when you're basically hiding in a place where there's no windows, and you just kind of have to stay quiet all day for so long. And as you can imagine, all sorts of issues. Cramped people. Anne had a very boisterous personality, and that rubbed people the wrong way too. Her sister was always this calm, nice person, and that caused a lot of fights and issues. And then they're running out of food, and then their clothing started to get moth-eaten, and then people started to get sick, or they needed doctors or dentists, and then they had to do their own stuff to basically heal themselves or treat themselves. And it was just a big issue. Look at this one. Dear Kitty. Kitty's the name of her diary. Yesterday, Madam and Dr. Drussel were washing the dishes while I tried very hard not to start a fight. And as you can see here, it kind of goes on about how, that starts to rub people the wrong way. And, it gets pretty emotional at times. It's almost like a movie in a way. They're cramped and they're stuck together for a long time, but even some romance happens. Dear Kitty, after dreaming about my Patel, I woke up in an utter state of confusion. Dearest, what a lovely smile this morning. If Father only knew what I was thinking about. Then I imagined me and Patel together crying, and it happened. So, I guess you're wondering what happened at the end. And that's really what the big thing was that I was curious about. As I started to get to browse towards the end of the book, you start to see some of the things that they go through and signs that, okay, the war is coming to an end. And I thought, okay, maybe she'll make it through. Maybe she will make it out alive and it'll be a happy ending. Unfortunately, life doesn't always work like that. It's random and it's tragic. And that's what really sucks about life. You can't always just depend on a happy ending, even though people love to delude themselves into thinking that. And it kind of sucks. But here's a page towards the end. Once again, she's dreaming. 2 nights ago, I dreamed I was skating here in the living room with that little boy from the Apollo skating rink and the spindly-legged sister. When I woke up in a sweat, I was glad Peter hadn't said that. After all, the people who supply us food coupons had been arrested, and our special black market agent, Mr. M, was captured by the Germans in a violent raid. So a lot of people were working with them in secret to supply them with food and smuggling clothes and whatever to their secret second half of the house. But over time, things started happening where the Germans kept arresting these people, and then, as you can tell, the food is wretched. The kitchen smells like a mixture of spoiled plums, rotten eggs, and brine. The potatoes are diseased. And, there are various signs that maybe, just maybe, things were getting better, or at least the war was progressing. This is a step towards the end where basically a plane crashed nearby where they were hiding, and they found out that the Germans shot down all the people who escaped in parachutes while they were flying down. And what I also noticed was that throughout the book, there's all these other countries who were not happy about what was going on. It says here, the Amsterdammers who saw it seethed with rage at such a dastardly deed. You have to keep in mind here that World War II involved various different countries, and Germany invaded many countries, many of which were neutral or seemed to be, kind of, not along the same thought process as the Germans about how evil the Jews were. I also like how the book kind of gave a few stats at the beginning, saying something. One thing that was said was the Jews only made up less than 1% of the population, and yet they were kind of drilled in on as the cause and of all their economic downfall, and they need to be exterminated. It also speaks to the danger and scariness of human nature and politics, which is how a scapegoat or something to blame and focus on is often used and manipulated in politics to really just drive a mass population towards something and drive a massive amount of sometimes excessive hate towards a group, which can cause severe suffering. And that's what I'm scared of. I think it could happen again. So what ends up happening with this girl? Well, things get worse and worse. They got searched. They got very close to being found, but the Germans didn't find their bookcase. And then, she continues to dream, and she continues to think that, there's hope. D-Day happens. The big invasion happens. And people, the fight's progressing. They do a mass invasion. Thousands of planes, tanks. Things are looking up and then back down. There's hope, right? This massive invasion happens, and the sentiment is positive. Those awful Germans have oppressed and threatened us for so long that the thought of friends and salvation means everything to us. Now it's not just the Jews, but Holland and all of occupied Europe. So things are looking up, but at the same time, it's still very tough, and there's still a ways out to go. She starts to kind of fantasize about, life after, or if it's possible, and maybe, she'll get out alive. But, obviously the mental strain on a lot of these people are getting crazy. There's people who are, cramped and in these quarters hiding out for too long. And one of these people, I think it was a family friend, a mom, she talks about she's going crazy a bit. She's considering killing herself, shooting herself, hanging herself. She's getting jealous, offended. Emotions and tensions are high. And then it gets to a point where the diary ends. And this is where it gets very sad. So this is her last diary entry, which is simply a essay really about human contradictions. So not necessarily that related. Uh, it's actually, quite poetic. She talks a bit about being kind of a mixture of different things. But I think what you're all here for is what happened. It was what I was here for. And the afterword is rather sad. So on the morning of August 4th, 1944, a car pulled up, 7 figures emerged, an SS sergeant, and at least 3 Dutch members of the security police, armed but in civilian clothes. Someone must have tipped them off. They arrested the 8 people hiding in the annex, as well as 2 of their helpers, and took all the valuables and cash they could find. After the arrest, and then it goes into detail on every one of these people and how they ended up. Now, what I found interesting was some of them were able to make it out alive in some way, shape, or form, but many of them ended up, unfortunately, being gassed or died from a sickness or starvation or the mental strain in a concentration camp. So it talks about Kugler and Kleiman. Kugler was able to get released on September 1944. He remained in Amsterdam until his death in 1959. Some people like Miep Gijs died on January 11th, 2010 in the Netherlands at the age of 100. And you're probably wondering most about Anne and her, perfect sister Margot. Margot was always the sister that they compared her to, and Margot was much more even-keeled. They were transported from Auschwitz at the end of October and taken to Bergen-Belsen, a concentration camp near Hanover, Germany. The typhus epidemic broke out in the winter of 1944 to 45 as a result of the horrendous hygiene conditions. Killed thousands of prisoners, including Margot, and a few days later Anne. She must have died in late February or early March. The bodies of both girls were probably dumped in Bergen-Belsen's mass graves. The camp was liberated by British troops on April 12, 1945. Otto Frank was the only one of the 8 to survive the concentration camps. After Auschwitz was liberated by Russian troops, he was repatriated to Amsterdam by way of Odessa and Marseille. He arrived in Amsterdam on June 3rd, 1945 and stayed there until 1954. And then it goes on about his life, where he died on 1980. Otto Frank continued to live in Bursfelden outside of Basel, where he devoted himself to sharing the message of his daughter's diary with people all over the world. Very sad story, and while I think some younger generations may say, oh, this is old news, it really is not. I mean, this guy died in 1980, which was just a couple decades ago, not even, a third of someone's lifetime ago. And it's really sad. We're not talking thousands of years ago. We're not talking 2000 BC or millions of years ago when the dinosaurs were, or even, a couple centuries ago. We're talking within one lifetime this happened. And it makes me very grateful about, just being born in the U.S. and having a system in a country where, it's not that crazy that, something ridiculous could happen and your life could change immediately based off, political changes to that extent at least. It also, I think it also worries me a bit because, what if that does happen, Every ethnic group, unless you're, male and Caucasian usually, they're all at risk at some point. Oftentimes they're persecuted or there's hatred put on them, and who knows what might happen. But it just sucks that the world happens this way. I mean, Anne was so close to liberation in a sense. Yes, I think they still had a year, and that still sucks, On August 4th, 1944, they were caught. And then if they had lasted about 10 more months, they would have made it. But at the same time, Anne, she survives supposedly until, February or March of the year that they were liberated. If she had made it just a couple more months, she might have been able to make it out alive. But against the odds were not in her favor. 1 out of 8 survived. I've read other books about this period in my English class, and it is just crazy how the world is. Some people will talk about, Germany and Germans, and now I don't know how the sentiment is. I think, for a lot of Americans, at least that I know, they don't really talk that bad about Germany anymore. It's almost like water under a bridge to an extent. Sure, I think certain terms like Nazi will come up in a negative way with negative sentiment, but it's almost more of like the video game meme culture. When you get very angry at a video game, it gets brought up. I think another great movie that's worth watching, which covers this in a more kind of positive sentiment, is one that was filmed by Steven Spielberg. And I watched it while trying to go through like the top 100 films of all time. And it's basically about a man who was successfully able to smuggle out hundreds of Jews through the guise of his business. In the process, he basically emptied his coffers. He was very rich, and he could have continued to be very rich, but he played a double agent and smuggled out a lot of Jews and risked his life doing so. He was a hero in a way, and he still didn't think he did enough. But at the same time, it really starts to think deep about all these things. And Steven Spielberg, who I think he has a Jewish heritage, he also kind of talks about his thoughts on set, where he would get angry at times when he would see actors in the Jewish garb, some of them who were of German descent. And I think during one of the kind of like behind the scenes talks, he discussed how like he shouldn't really, put the sins of the father on the child. And so, there's a bit of that I think is worth, paying respect to. Just because someone is German doesn't necessarily mean you immediately rule them as evil. But it's important to remember history and keep things in mind to an extent, because you don't really know for sure if it's never going to happen again. Tons of times history repeats because people don't read history, and people just repeat the same things and make the same mistakes. That happens all the time on YouTube with a lot of these YouTubers showing off how wealthy they are and showboating, only to repeat again and face again a lot of the issues that come with that fame and showboating the wealth they've achieved. Something that history has already shown others the consequences of. So, very sad story. And I think, off the get-go, I think there's so much going on with the whole flight patterns of a lot of the people trying to escape Germany. And so it does make me wonder, like there was something I saw in I think museum, or maybe it was a image on the internet, but essentially it showed the flight patterns of all the Jewish people from Germany or nearby areas when World War II was happening. And they went everywhere. Some went to Canada, some went to South America, some went to Europe, Southeast Asia, all over. And it kind of shows to me the complexities of the world, and how it kind of, all the macroeconomic factors, and how everyone's immigrating everywhere. And for them, they actually they did try to escape the country. So here's what it says here. My father and mother married in Germany, so they were in Germany. But then, when the war started getting bad, and the Jewish people were discriminated against, father moved to Amsterdam, And then Mother and Margot, her sister, followed a bit later while I stayed in Germany with Grandma. On Margot's 8th birthday, I came from Germany as a surprise present. Life in Holland was beautiful. Remember when I said at the beginning, like they had a pretty good life in many ways. It wasn't like low class income in a way. We went ice skating all the time and even took ski holidays in the Swiss Alps. Once again, that was a surprise to me because without much knowledge, I just had assumed, they were living a low income life before, but no, they were kind of living pretty decent. I saw the same thing when I saw like in the Holocaust Museum I went to, like a depiction of how they lived before things happened, and they lived pretty good. I mean, imagine that, like you were living in a pretty good time, and then like that, things change because your country decides to paint you as the evil incarnate, and it really sucks. Like things just got worse and worse. They burned down synagogues, Jewish-owned shops, smashed windows, burned books about Jewish culture or written by Jews. Does that include the Bible? It just doesn't make sense to me why they would do that. But then they got so... When Germany invaded Holland, they started almost segregating and basically excluding people there. They weren't allowed in the swimming pools anymore. Then they weren't allowed on trams or cars. But they could still ride bikes, right? Well, like a week later, 2 weeks later, no bikes either. So excessive discrimination, and also just kind of speaks to potentially another terrible part of human nature, which is, the mass population's tendency to siphon out sometimes subtle differences between people based off their skin color, ethnicity, way of being, and then basically saying that these people are worse and different and persecuting them. And that's caused all sorts of issues throughout the years: slavery, segregation, apartheid. And it just, I think we are hopefully moving in the right way, but, unfortunately, it's scary, but maybe there's something about human nature that causes that. I remember watching a documentary. It was actually really cool. It's more of a TV show than a documentary, but it's on Netflix. It's really cool. It's called America's Most Wanted. And one of the episodes was about a African millionaire by the name of Felice Kabuya or something like that, who basically funded a mass genocide and basically used radio to convince a certain population in a country in Africa that another different tribe was basically evil incarnate, and they basically orchestrated and funded a mass genocide by supplying machetes to all the other tribes, and I think hundreds of thousands or something were killed. It's very sad. This book and her diary, it's also funny because she wanted this just to be her personal journal that no one ever reads, and now millions have. And in a way, thankfully it has, because it's just a honest, heartwarming view of her life that spans the test of time. There's a little passage here that's very interesting where, she talks about how she might be lesbian. She says, she talks about this little thing here about a period in her life where she basically wanted to kiss another girl. Also kind of goes into the complexities of the human being and what's genetic and what's religious and all that stuff, and cultural too, because really at the core, I remember I was in a study group, and there's a very friendly Jewish person there as well, and he had a short discussion with me, and he's like, being Jewish is something you can choose to do. It's about adopting a religion. So he told me I could be Jewish if I wanted to, and so he said it's not a ethnicity in a way, it is a culture or religion. And so that's the part that's, you know, also at its core to me, very funny because, sure, in this case, the Germans ascribed the Jewish people to be a culture and ethnicity in a group, and perhaps there were because there was generally a condensed type of people that were that way, and that's what they persecuted. But at its core, it's essentially a religion, and so anyone could be, which almost defeats the whole thought process of how these people are different. But I guess they focused on the cultural group that they represented. And another shocking part is that they weren't even really Jewish. So essentially, they didn't really even practice Judaism. They were pretty non-religious. Well, then how were they labeled and persecuted, and why? Well, essentially, because they were Jewish enough. So look at this. It was like one of the very first pages in the book. Being Jewish was not so important in our home. Mother did come from a traditional background, but we kept things religion free. Like, look at that. There's literally a Christmas tree here. And they kept things religion free. So imagine that, like, not only, imagine being persecuted all of a sudden one day, not just for one little thing about you, but something that your family barely or doesn't even practice anymore, but something that on your mother's side you came from as a traditional background once upon a time. I mean, it sucks. It really does. And what can we do about it now? It's really just down to kind of preserving, spreading that message, so such atrocities never happen again. Here's another interesting part. So they immigrated to Holland, and they actually faked escaping to Switzerland when Holland got bad. Instead, I think the dad made a judgment call to essentially hide out and stay in Holland in that little hidden part of that house. So what if they had immigrated or escaped in another way? Well, perhaps that's the story of other families who did successfully do that. As mentioned, many of them did successfully escape to Canada or Southern America or North America or whatnot. But I imagine it was hard. I imagine, just based off the implication, that it was very difficult to move countries. Probably the Germans were, occupying the borders. Even as they escaped their home, there was Germans patrolling the streets. So I assume, if they could have escaped to another country far, far away, at least in my opinion, that would have been the ideal situation. But for whatever reason, they didn't do that. Here's them faking it as if they fled to Switzerland because, essentially they made it seem like they made an impromptu rush to escape, but in reality, they had been preparing for an entire day already. And they wore like 7 layers of clothes just to bring all their clothes with them. But they really just moved to the place where his father worked. And so, afterwards, what's funny was, after they left that note saying they escaped to Switzerland, there was all these rumors about like what happened to them. They went on vacation to the countryside. A military vehicle picked them up. Or a German SS officer had smuggled them across the Swiss border. So I'm assuming they were already too late. They got to a point where Germany already occupied Holland, and even if they tried to escape, they couldn't, because the German soldiers would have blocked them off at the border. And I imagine, this was a tough situation where they were assessing things, and it was an uncertain future. So they didn't know that Holland would get invaded, and even when it happened, maybe it was too quick, and they didn't want to uproot their family again, and they didn't know the potential future implications of that and how gruesome the concentration camps and the extermination of the Jewish people would be. So very, very crazy thing. Even the Holocaust Museum, I mean, I remember a few profiles of people who either ended up escaping a concentration camp through uprisings or revolts, or some of them got revenge. They were basically like, we're just going to slaughter these German occupants because of all the torture that they went through. And it seemed like, in terms of religion, that's a very tough thing to go through, because what do you actually get out of it? You think you have your religion and all this stuff, and it's not really always helping them. So many people still died in suffering despite their religion, and their God wasn't there to save them. And it makes me wonder how many people kind of lost their religion after that. I think I heard somewhere that some of them did renounce their religion after it. So crazy, crazy life. Well recommend checking this out. You could get an audiobook version. You can get the just plain text version. But hopefully you found this useful. Like, subscribe. In terms of the comments, let's try and keep it positive. I don't want it to get to some type of crazy, radical internet argument. But, what can we... Leave your comments. What value, what positivity did you learn from it? Did you watch this whole 40-minute video? If you did, thank you. What kept you interested? What did you find out about it that you can take into your own life for the future in a positive way? How will you take this moving forward? What do you think you've learned from it? Thanks for watching. Incredible story from a real person, real life. And that's what makes it so captivating, but also so scary. It does make me feel more grateful for my life. I mean, that was just a life of just pure survival. And they never got the luxuries to be attempting to grow a YouTube channel or all that stuff. So, thanks for watching. See you later.